Good evening. I'm Council President Stone Cipher, and I'm Chair of the Budget and Finance Committee for the City of Everett, and we're calling to order the Budget Committee meeting for this evening. And we have our finance team here, and thank you, council members, for being here today. Up first on our agenda is the April financial report. So, Susie, I'll let you take it over.
Thank you. Actually, Heidi, our budget manager, is going to be giving the briefing on the financial
thank you.
report
Welcome,
tonight.
Heidi.
So take it away, Heidi.
Yes, good evening, council. Can you hear me? Perfect. All right. Like what? Awesome. So we did have outstanding results for the month of April. General government revenues came in 1.3 million or 11.6% over our monthly budget. This brings our year-to-date position to 3.6 million or 9.6% over our budget. Sales tax, business and occupation tax, utility taxes, and miscellaneous revenues are what are driving these results. Sales tax had another great month with receipts at 389,000 or 15.4% over budget. Year to date, we are now at 7.1% above budget. There is a 2-month lag with sales tax, so it is important to note that the April reported revenues actually represent February receipts. For business and occupation tax, this also came in strong at 480,000 or 16.1% over our monthly budget. This brings the year-to-date total to nearly 1.6 million or 22.5% over the original forecast. And this is highly attributable to the aerospace, so they're largely responsible for our excess receipts here. Utility tax receipts came in 114,000 or 8.6% over budget in April. This brings the year-to-date total to nearly 609,000 or 11.7% over our original forecast. Natural gas, telephone, and electricity taxes are all contributing to the positive performance for this revenue. All right, miscellaneous revenues were 72,000 or 8% over budget this month. Positive performance was seen in most line items within this category. However, our largest contributors would be interest earnings as well as transfers within funds. So year to date now, we are about 25.6% above our budget. All right, so year to date, our sales tax receipts are now about 815,000 or 7.1% over budget. The table here represents our 6 largest sales tax categories. The percent each category makes up of total sales tax receipts based on year to date actual results, as well as the cumulative over/under budget status. In April, we saw good performance across the major sectors, with retail and construction accounting for most of the excess receipts. General merchandise, building materials, and clothing did fall short within the sectors here. All right, so year-to-date, general government expenditures total $47.5 million. This brings our year-to-date position to 1.9 million or 3.9% under budget. The first budget amendment is reflected in our April report, which includes the distribution of our labor contingency from Fund 009 non-departmental to the various general government funds in order to cover the 2023 labor cost and the COLA adjustments. If we were to equally distribute the general government expenditure budget across 12 months, we would expect a third of the budget to be expended as of the end of April 30th. Although there is some seasonality in department spend, most do fall within this trend. Where we're seeing an above budget is within our non-departmental Fund 009, and this is primarily due to jail activity cost reaching pre-pandemic levels. So right now we're about 297,000 over our year-to-date budget. So we are constantly monitoring this. We do have a model in which we record all of the monthly invoices that we are submitting to the county and SCORE. If there is a need to increase the budget, we'll do so around Budget Amendment 3. That takes place sometime in September, October, if there is a need. To close our year-to-date update, we do want to go over some non-general government items. The city does collect 0.5% in real estate excise taxes on the value of real estate transactions occurring within the city's boundaries. 0.25% is accounted for in our Fund 162 CIP2, and this helps support debt service. The other 0.25% is accounted for in Fund 154 CIP3, and this funds parks and street projects that are approved by City Council. The table in the chart here, though, represents just a 0.25% rate to identify the amount that's posted to each of those funds. It's an equal distribution, 1/4 and 1/4 to 0.5% rate. Year-to-date receipts per 0.25% total nearly $889,000, which is 13.7% under our budget, but REIT is notoriously volatile, and it's based on different factors. So as an example, in 2010, we saw REIT receipts at a low of $1.2 million, but in 2021, we saw a high of $7 million. All right, and the city also does impose a 2% lodging tax. These revenues fund our $100,000 required contribution to the Everett Public Facilities District. We also have $150,000 for city tourism and marketing program, and then there's that $545,000 in grants for local events. Similar to sales tax, there is that 2-month lag, so what you're seeing here is the February receipts. Lodging tax total nearly $214,000, and that is actually 24.6% over our original forecast. And if we do continue at this pace, then the city will be more available to fund more tourism-related activities and tourism-related facilities in our upcoming budget. All right, are there any questions on the April financial report before I turn it over to Susie?
Yes.
Sure.
Councilmember Zerlingo.
Thank you. There was earlier a note on property taxes. Now, has that got, I'm not sure how that's apportioned. I noticed that was below what was expected, and I'm not sure what the implications of that are.
So property tax has really two main months where most of the collection occurs. So in April, you're not going to see that highlighted, but hopefully in May and October, you'll see a jump in those revenues.
Okay, so it's not an annualized thing. That's how that comes in. Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Ryan.
That was my exact question. Thank you.
Councilmember Schwab.
Yeah, I briefly wanted to talk about if you could have just maybe say a few sentences about the trends. And basically the trends reflecting here in our budget. This is a pretty common trend, or are we seeing something, say, last 3, 5, 10? Obviously with COVID, it's a little more difficult, but like 5, 10 years, are we on a normal trend as far as expenditures and revenue?
So what I did note here for expenditures is generally we would see about a 33.3% spend, and overall in general government we're seeing on average 30% spend. So some of that could be a reduction in labor cost, is why we're not at our peak 33% at this time.
Okay, how about as far as revenue sources? Not necessarily the percentage itself, but the trend. When receipts come in, when sales tax even fluctuates, those sort of things. I was just wondering where the trends are.
In our models for general government revenues, it does take into account the multiple years, and sales tax is a lot more challenging, right, because it ebbs and flows. So as far as how we forecast sales tax revenues, it's really taking into account what we've seen over the last 6 years, because in our budget we do look at a 6-year forecast. In this instance, we did take out 2020 because it was very much an outlier and didn't really speak to what we're seeing now. Sorry, is there something you want to elaborate on that?
I can add. Sure. So, I'm sorry. Especially in sales tax, we're seeing robust receipts due to construction. So construction is still going very strong, which is really great to see, great for our economy. And just, all of the stimulus that was going out in 2020 and 2021, it really impacted consumers' ability to be able to spend money. And of course, that goes into sales tax. Prior, if we take 2020 out because it was such an outlier, it took a long time to claw our way out of the Great Recession. We didn't get back to pre-recession sales tax for, I want to say, a good 10 years. And so that was a long, slow grind up. But then we started to really recover, again, largely due to construction. That's been our high point. So to the extent that we're still seeing construction, robust construction continue, at least in the next forecasting cycle, that will really support our sales tax forecast. And of course, we do meet in the summer with our colleagues from the permitting and planning departments to take a look at what projects are in process, what are just have applied for permits, how some of the projects that are already in progress, how far along are they, how much left do they have to do, and that is what we base our next year's forecast on.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Thank you. And I had failed to mention that our agenda has changed slightly tonight. Item 1, which was the 2022 year-end wrap-up, has been postponed, and we're moving on now from the April financial report to an added item, a resolution on ARPA funding.
Okay. So regarding the resolution and budget ordinance that is going to be on the council agenda for tonight, as you know, the debt ceiling negotiations generated significant concern regarding the status of our American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA allocation. And while it appears that that immediate urgency to spend the funds has diminished, there is still concern about what might happen going forward. So we're recommending to move forward with the resolution and ordinance that have been added to tonight's agenda. The proposal includes using the remaining ARPA funding to reimburse the general fund for police and fire labor costs. The funding will be brought in as a revenue to the general fund and then will be posted to fund balance. Recall that by policy, we cannot spend fund balance without additional approval from council. So it'll remain in fund balance for a few weeks while we prepare a new locally funded program in the General Government Special Projects Fund. And at that point, the funding will be transferred to the new locally funded program. Once that's complete, we'll be requesting budget authority to fund the previously approved ARPA projects in this new program. Another benefit to this action is because the projects will then be funded with local funds, we won't be subject to the ARPA spend down deadlines. And that way, we'll be able to use these funds to support the programs that are ongoing that have been started with ARPA funding, such as the mental health professionals in the library and fire departments for a longer period of time. So in order to keep this moving forward, we're also asking for council's approval to continue the work necessary to deliver the projects that you've already approved in previous resolutions. As part of this resolution. So I thought it would be a good idea to review where we are in the fund. So I will go over some numbers now. Our original allocation was just under $20.7 million, and that money has been invested, and as of April has earned nearly $400,000, which together with the original allocation gives us $21.1 million in total resources to spend. As of May 23rd, we have spent $1.9 million, leaving an unspent balance of $19.2 million. From that amount, we will need to leave $1,162,777 excuse me, in the ARPA grant fund to complete the Everett Ford grant program. The reason why we need to carve out the Everett Ford grants is because we would not be able to give private businesses money outside of the ARPA program. It isn't something we could do with local funding. So that leaves us a little over $18 million available to reimburse the general fund for police and fire labor costs. So now let's switch gears a bit and look at the existing remaining budget allocation in the ARPA fund. The projects listed should look familiar and were approved in the previous resolutions that I mentioned before. We did pull out 3 Everett Forward Grant projects, which are shown at the bottom of the list, because although these projects were requested by grant applicants, it was determined that the city could execute them more effectively because they were all projects that were working on city property. The total budget remaining on the approved projects is $10.4 million, which leaves us with $7.6 million in unbudgeted funding. Now we have the projects that were recently approved in Resolution 7878, which total $1.2 million. These projects have not yet been formally appropriated via ordinance, and after funding Resolution 7878, we have $6.4 million remaining that will be available for new allocations. And that concludes what I've brought for the briefing on the resolution and ordinance, and be happy to answer any questions. I understand it gets a little confusing because we're moving from cash, how much cash do we have, and a totally different topic, which is how much have we budgeted and how much of that budget authority remains. So I apologize for that, but I wanted to share the full story.
Questions, comments? Councilmember Vogely?
One right off the top is if, I see here the city council recovery grants. And so I was gonna say, what about those? But if we can't, if the Everett Forward grants must be carved out because we cannot use general funds, local funds for businesses, how would we be able to use the council recovery grants?
The council recovery grants would be, you would be able to use them for anything that the city could spend as a governmental purpose. So you could use it for parks, you could use it for funding low-income programs. So, for example, low-income childcare programs, anything that the city was legally able to do.
So we wouldn't have as much, as many options if it goes into the general fund.
There are slightly fewer options, I guess I would say. However, qualifying for the special provisions that the ARPA grant allows is not an easy task. So, you still have to meet, for example, for their economic harm eligibility category, you still have to meet the criteria in order to qualify for that. So, okay, go ahead.
Can I just add, and I might fumble a little bit, so you might need to help me out, but the Everett Forward grants are, in my mind, very specific. That term grant is very specific. We allocated, people applied, we allocated money, we gave it back to them. Where the term here, City Council recovery grants, is meant to be broader. So we didn't envision that city council members would only utilize their funds to do a grant program with applications, et cetera, but that, as Susie said, you could utilize those funds in a much broader way. So that term grant maybe isn't the best term for the city council recovery funding that you have available to use. Does that make sense?
What you've said makes sense. I think my question still remains that it's a whole different threshold. We haven't gone through our first discussions with administration to figure out what the threshold is to be able to give the 100,000 per council member. So I don't know what the first threshold was, but if it's going to go into a different pot of money with different rules for allocating, then it's a completely different threshold. And so broad is still broad.
So I think the primary difference here, and we can use the Everett Forward grants as a good example, is when we went and went through the application process and, all of that to identify the successful grant awards, the businesses had to qualify. So they had to demonstrate economic harm. And so it wasn't just anybody could apply and get an Everett Ford grant. They had to qualify. They couldn't be given more money than their losses due to COVID had been. And if any of it involved construction, like several of the grants anyway, involved storefront work or, some sort of refurbishment, they had to be located in a qualified census tract. So you have a lot of layers, and within those layers, we could, if they met all of those thresholds, we were then able to give money, grants to support these local businesses, private businesses. As a city, we can serve the poor and infirm with our general fund dollars. And so that would include, think of all of Julie's projects with the mental health professionals, caseworkers, day center, I could keep going on. All of those are projects that we certainly can do as a city because we're helping the poor and infirm, and we're allowed to do that. It's not considered gift of public funds. It's when we are giving money to a private business. We can give money to, as a city, we can work with nonprofits, as we always do with our human needs grants. So you'll think of Kembra's projects, and she works with local nonprofits to serve the needy in our community in various ways, whether it's food banks and just a whole host of human needs sort of activities. And so you could still do that either way. So if there was a project that somebody was considering that involved giving money to a private business, that wasn't where we were giving them money to run a program for people in need, then we might need to talk about that to see whether, we
yeah.
could still do it. So I don't know if any of the council members had something like that in mind to do with their money. That would be really the difference for you.
Can I just say that there could be the option of retaining the 700,000 in that ARPA bucket, but all the federal regulations around spending the dollars would be there. So there's an option there without kind of throwing everything out with our proposal, if you're worried about that 700,000 and concerned that it's too restrictive.
Thank you.
Understanding, though, that the ARPA funds also have all of their restrictions too, so,
And they would have.
yeah, they would have. So,
Councilmember Ryan.
Thank you. Just to piggyback on that a little bit with my other hat at the county, the county council has their district dollars as well, and it does come from a similar general fund bucket, and it is helpful for allocations to smaller nonprofits because there aren't the federal hoops that smaller nonprofits have to jump through in order to qualify to receive those dollars. So it is helpful for allocation for both the staff side and the organization side because there's fewer federal hoops to jump through.
yeah, I would have to say that I've heard that from Kemba as well.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add that normally the city would never give money to a private business that wasn't doing some kind of project that we would consider to be in the public interest. But these ARPA funds were special because we were actually really sort of lining the pockets of business owners because they had losses, and so they were being paid back for those losses, kind of as private business owners, but which we obviously can't do. So if anybody, if you are thinking about a project, maybe chat with Susie because we could also think about keeping some of those dollars separate if we wanted to. If there was something going on that, might need to have the federal allowance.
But the resolution is tonight.
Yeah, yes.
So 15 minutes in between 5.
Councilmember Ryan.
Thanks. I have a couple questions. So for thank you for putting together the itemization of ARPA projects that total 1.8 million. I guess my confusion is coming from It seems like there's a bit of a purgatory involved, where I know we've approved funding for purchasing restrooms, the design for the police property room relocation, but I'm not seeing it on the list, so it was approved here, so is it just waiting for a check to be cut? And just seems like there's these dollars that are maybe not accounted for, or just in a weird purgatory situation.
No purgatory, I assure you. So the projects that you're talking about are just where we haven't received an invoice for them. They're all moving forward in one level or another. A lot of them are in procurement. I know, for example, the bathrooms, the public bathrooms have been through council, but we had to go through that whole procurement process in order to be able to order them. And then it takes quite a while for them to be built. So that's why you're seeing a delay on some of these going forward. I know I have, Public Works has some design invoices that they're looking to pay on the bridge. And there's various things like that. So some of it is going through the procurement process, and others, we just haven't seen bills on it yet. Some of the, like the pallet shelter expansion, we're working through another grant money first, and then we'll spend this one. So we have some other funding for that. There's just a variety of reasons. You know, we can go through an update on where each of these lie. The digital permit accelerator, I know they've ordered equipment. It's just not here yet, so we haven't paid for it. Things like that.
Thanks. So I guess, which brings me to my next question. If the council has approved money from an ARPA bucket, but then it's going to be spent from a different bucket, is there any accounting reconciliation troubles there with just making sure it works out, or is it okay that the money actually comes from a different place than it was approved to come from?
Well, we are going to be bringing back a budget ordinance once we create the new program in Fund 155. And so you'll be essentially reapproving all of the same projects, and that will officially, formally reappropriate the money for those in this new program, which is locally funded.
Great.
Susie, can you clarify, that's not the budget ordinance that's on the agenda tonight, correct?
No, there was no time to have accounting to create these new funds before I got the ordinance on the agenda tonight. And so we'll be just bringing back another budget ordinance to you shortly that will create that fund and appropriate these existing projects in that fund. And then that ordinance will also move the money from the general fund's fund balance into the new fund.
Great. Go ahead.
Vice President Tui.
Yeah, Susie, I think what would be helpful, I know for me, is looking at the list of projects that we've approved, that budget, and then in the column next to it, what we've spent as you update us, and then we can see the remainder so that we know what's coming down, what we haven't paid for, and the remainder. And I think that would just be a really easy way for us to look at an update whenever you do that.
Yeah, I can go ahead and update this worksheet. You do have in this slide, just, it's not together, so it's not as convenient, and I will
Yeah.
certainly provide you with a one-pager on
That'd be
that.
great.
But just so you know, you do have that information on this
Right.
slide. That's the amount of budget that's
Right.
remaining for each of those projects.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Other questions? Councilmember Ryan.
Thanks. By moving the money over, are we missing out on more interest?
Well, it will then earn interest in its new fund.
Great. Is that more or less than what we're, same?
Same.
Okay. And then I'm hoping you can walk me through, helping me understand. So when I think of general fund, I think of it as everybody's swimming pool that everybody gets to swim in. So not everybody, but close enough. But this resolution is calling out very specific reimbursements for a specific department. So why this public safety specifically, why not parks, why not IT? Because when I think of how COVID's impacted the city, it's impacted every department. If you could help walk me through why just this bucket specifically, and how it is a bucket within the larger swimming pool of the general fund.
This reimbursement is not going to impact any department's budget. It's going to come in as a revenue to the general fund. No departments have their own revenues. It's the general fund's revenues. So this doesn't change a budget allocation to police and fire at all, because it's coming in as a revenue to the general fund, and then it's going to be sitting in fund balance, which is not in any department. In fact, it's in our Fund 009, non-departmental fund. That's where the general fund's fund balance sits. So it's going to sit there until we come back to you with the new fund set up and a new program in a couple of weeks, at which point we will ask for an expenditure authority to transfer it out to the new fund. So it's an in and out of the general fund. It's a temporary parking space. Thanks.
Councilmember Vogely.
I'm looking it up now, but so why are there certain departments that are named in the amount of 18 million, blah, blah, to reimburse the general fund for police and fire labor costs, except for funds set aside for the grant programs?
And quite frankly, the reason why we chose police and fire as the ones that we would be reporting to the Treasury, that's how we used the ARPA funding, is because they are the biggest funds. This is a lot of money, and we can expend it all in one entry because we've already incurred that much costs in those departments. Again, this has no impact on the departments. It has no impact on their budget. It's just, it's an accounting function, quite frankly, to move this money, to spend the money, and then create capacity in the general fund, because we've then brought in all of this revenue and increased fund balance. We didn't increase we're not increasing expenditures in the general fund with this. We're just putting it in fund balance, where, as you know, we can't spend fund balance without additional authority from council. So it's a place to set it until we come back to you in a couple of weeks with another ordinance to recreate our own program
That
to
makes
deliver
sense.
to deliver these programs. So it could have been police and fire, it could have been parks, it could have been finance, but we're not big enough, to to consume $18 million. So.
That makes sense, thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Susie.
Okay.
And finally, we look at revenue options.
Okay. So last week, or not last week, but at the last budget committee meeting, I gave a briefing to refresh everybody on the revenue options that are available to us to try to improve the city's financial position. And, as I mentioned at the time, we're currently looking at a $9.1 million deficit to close for 2024. And without any change in our current revenue and expenditure patterns, that number will grow to $32 million by 2029. So I did conclude at the last briefing that our recommendation was to move forward with a levy lid lift and on property tax, and hopefully get it on the ballot in November of 2024, so that we can begin to see revenue in 2025. And I wanted to bring this back tonight to give council an opportunity to discuss the options further and our recommendation for the path forward. And it would be extremely helpful to get some direction from council regarding where they would like to go with these revenue options, because all of them, any one of them would take a significant amount of work to get on the ballot by not this November, but the following November. So we would really need to begin planning soon. And so I would just open that up. Questions on the options, comments for council members?
Questions, comments? Councilmember Schwab?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's important because someone might view, or might be viewing out there or turn this in, really, could you make a couple of sentences about really how the city has, and your office, really has reduced spending? And we have reduced the amounts of our reserves, and we've reduced the amount of our facilities. We're not putting the dollars into our buildings that we should to keep them up. So could you just make a few statements about generalizing about what we've done in the last, really, this has been an ongoing challenge for the last 5 to 6 years?
And even longer.
And longer, yeah.
20 for me.
Yes, exactly. So,
And I guess if I'm gonna be out in the public and I suggest, hey, we need to raise taxes, why didn't you do it, or why now, right? Maybe that's really important that we communicate to those that we represent, is why now? Why not before, or why not next year, right?
well, I think that there was serious consideration given to do it before COVID hit. And of course, that was just not the time to ask people to pay more for property tax. Going longer history, I think you did a pretty good job of outlining what we've done. We have cut programs. The city of Everett, for all intents and purposes, no longer has a recreation program, closed the swimming pool. There are fewer staff in many of the departments than there were. And over the years, if you go over the long term for this, we have deferred contributions to our long-term liabilities, like the Left One Police and Fire pension funds. We've deferred contributions to our capital reserves, such as, well, we didn't even create CIP 1 for our major facility work until 2016. And we're underfunding our vehicle replacements. The increase in the cost of fire trucks, we have 3 on order right now, and we need to put like 2 more, I think, on order. And the cost has gone up incredibly just in the last couple of years. So we have a lot of ground to make up in our reserves. Our buildings are suffering from it. There is a lot of work to be done at the Everett Municipal Building, and many of our other facilities need a significant amount of work. We've reduced our contributions to overlay, so that impacts the status of our streets, the maintenance of our streets, which is really important, because the more you maintain them over time, the less it costs you. Because if you delay maintenance, then it generally just costs you more when you finally get around to it. So I think you did a really pretty good job of outlining that. And it's just with all of these things, there comes a point when you just can't keep doing it. And there's always a reluctance to cut services. And I think that is one of the strong points in why now. Because we don't want to cut services anymore.
And Chair, may I continue? I think it's important to state that some of the allocations that we haven't been spending on really are going to cost us more dollars in the long run. Some of the building maintenance that we have put off, especially, is that we really try to respect the needs of those who just didn't have the dollars due to the economy, due to COVID. But unfortunately, there's probably a higher cost, especially here in the last few years where now inflation has gone up so much. I think that's really an important message, that I think we're doing everything we can to keep costs down and not raise taxes. I know this is the 5 of us, we've only been here 18 months, so, we were kind of handed this here, and it's a tough decision to talk about, in a tough discussion to talk about raising taxes. I know that Councilmember Tu and Stonecipher have been dealing this for a long time, and so have you guys. Also, myself and the fire part, working for the fire department, it's always been a challenge. You can't say our fire stations and our police stations are in good, healthy condition. I know we've made some effort in the libraries. I think even the public notices that our parks we're doing a good job with what we have, but there's some improvements that need to be done. It's my intention to really keep talking about this. Because some people don't really, everyone's working, making a living, trying to do their life's work, their life's activities, and then we all of a sudden say we want to raise taxes, and they're like, oh, when did I didn't know about this, right? We're hearing about a lot of our things we're trying to do in the city. So I think we need to keep repeating this idea that the city's been doing everything they can to keep taxes down, and really come to that point where we're gonna have to make some serious cuts that I don't think are acceptable by most people. So I'm just gonna keep repeating this every time, just so those that finally say, oh yeah, they're gonna raise taxes, what, why? That they keep hearing the message. So I think that's important, so thanks.
Councilmember Wright?
Great, thank you. I think that the city's been doing a really amazing job of holding the dam for way longer than we probably should have had to. So I think that the top three options aren't really going to make a dent in what we need to safely secure the dam, if I can keep going with that analogy. So I personally would prefer to see moving forward with the levee lid lift. I think down the road, maybe 5-10 years, looking at a metropolitan parks district and supporting our parks. But leading with that, I don't think would be wise. I don't think the Snow-Owl merger is going to do nearly enough to help us in the long run. And as I mentioned last week, or when we had our budget briefing, they don't even want us. So what's not to love, though? And then for the RFA, I think there's a lot of concerns about that in general. So yeah, I'd love to, and a lot of pride in just our Everett Fire Department and just the amazing work that they do. So personally, I'd like to see moving forward with the levee lid lift as our focused option. I'm not a strategist, but I would be curious what the strategy is on if it could be added to an April special election or something sooner, like November 2024 just seems like a lifetime away. And if there's a way that we could bump that up, I would be supportive. I know it's a big lift and a lot of work, so I don't want to scare anybody, but just voter turnout wise and support wise, if that would be messaging wise, getting the word out wise, if that would be an option as well.
Other questions, comments? Councilmember Vogely, then Councilmember Zarlingo.
Do we also, so yes, levee lid lift, that seems like the only possible answer. Are we also talking about like the 4 different styles and which way to go with that at this discussion?
We certainly can. Do you want me to just review them shortly?
That would be
Because I could do that.
Yes,
Unfortunately, I don't have the slides with me tonight because I think that the pictures help. They really tell a story. You basically have 4 options when you go for a levee lid lift. You can get a temporary levee lid lift, either a one-time lift where you raise the taxes in the first year and then it grows at 1% for the next 6 years. But then at the end of that time period, if it's temporary, you fall off the cliff and you're back to where you would have been had you not done the lift. So that, for our situation, is not very helpful. You can also do a temporary lid lift where you have multiple lifts throughout the levy period of different amounts, or they could be any amount, whatever you put in the ballot. But again, at the end of the 6 years, you drop off that cliff and you're back to where you were. I can see those could be beneficial if you had a particular project you were trying to fund where it had an end date to it. So, but what we're trying to fund is our ongoing need to fund core services. So I think that it doesn't make good financial sense to get a temporary lift. The other 2 are either a one-time permanent or a one-time multi-year lift, and they're just like the temporary lifts, but the taxes do not drop off that cliff at the end of the lift period. They just will grow at 1% thereafter. So, so the one-time lift, permanent, is what we're recommending, and that's simply because it allows voters to understand that they're going to get this increase in taxes only in the first year, and then it's going to grow at 1% thereafter. And it seems like a simpler message to give to voters, although we could do a multi-year lid lift if that was something the council was interested in. So I hope that, was that?
Yes, I was pretty sure it was number 3 that was not one of the cliffs of insanity. So personally, that does sound like the best option to go forward with. I don't have a whole lot to say about it, but yes, we have been working on this for quite some time. And yes, we were talking about a lid lift a few years ago. So, long story short.
Thank you.
Yeah. Councilmember Zarlingo.
Well, first of all, thank you for making this as clear as it can be. Just like the movement and the funds you talked about earlier with ARPA, it's important that we be as clear as this as we can be. One of the things Councilmember Schwab was talking about trends in this, and one of the trends, I mean, in terms of discussing this with our community members, I want them to understand it and to feel positive about it in the sense that they're making a choice of the kind of community they want to live in, the trade-offs that we're all responsible for coping with here. In terms of trends, can you say anything overall about the sort of historic trends of what proportion of people's property taxes go to the city versus the total, say, of 20, 25 years ago, 10 years ago versus today? Because as I understand it, that's been going down. And I'd like to be able to put that in context for people who want to know from their property taxes what's going to the city.
I would have to agree that the percentage has gone down, and if we're just talking about Everett's regular levy, which is what we're talking about here, as opposed to EMS, which funds a specific service. It has gone down. It's right around the 18% rate right now. I'm thinking it was a little over 20 years ago. I would have to go back and look, because it's not something I've thought about for a while. So.
I remember looking at it sometime back and seeing some numbers
Yeah.
in the low 20s, 23, 24, in some
Something
cases
like that.
maybe a little lower. And some of that will depend a little depending on whether one is in the port district or not and that sort of thing. But I guess with the assent of administration, I would like to have a better sense of that, because I think it's a really useful thing in communicating to people and explaining the choice that if we pursue this, that we'd be asking them to make.
We can certainly provide that to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Vice President Dewey.
Yeah, thanks, Susie. Yeah, it'd be great. I wish I would have brought my PowerPoint copy of it. But I think one thing that people, anytime you say you're going to raise taxes, they have grandiose ideas of what the impact is going to be for them. So I think if we can always be showing what the average household, the impact will be for that year. I know you had that on some presentation, just so that it kind of puts it more in context and people can kind of understand, and then they can be more informed on the impact that we'll have on them.
And that is a whole other stage of this discussion. So if tonight I'm getting a general consensus from the council and administration that it is the property tax lid lift that we're going to be working on, then I will be developing data, information, things exactly like what you just mentioned, as far as what this means to the average homeowner. But the amount of the lift is going to be a big decision. And so that's something that the council will have to consider very carefully. And I will be providing information regarding options to that and levels where you will feel comfortable going. And, you know, basically the differences is how long will this lift resolve our deficit? Because even after we get this lift, then our revenues will not be growing as fast as our expenditures. So over time, the benefits of it erode, and we'll be back in the same position. So I'm sure most people are familiar that fire districts and RFAs, they do lid lifts with regularity, some of them every 5 years or so. And so that may be something that the city has to consider, because I know I've said many times this would not be a one and done action. But the question will be is how long do you want this to resolve the deficit issue before we have to go back and ask for another lift? So.
Councilmember Schwab.
Good, I'm glad you brought that up. That was another point that I was going to talk about is, as we're speaking with those we represent and they say, hey, you're going to raise my taxes, well, what do I get for it, right? I mean, I've heard it for years. Well, what you get is great great services and maintain them. There's no new shiny object here that we have. And in the end, we're still going to, it's not going to pay for it all. I think that does add a little bit of credibility to what we're doing. We're just trying to maintain. We're not adding anything, and it's not going to take care of us or take care of the city's finances forever. We're still going to have to go back. We're still going to have to be prudent. We're still going to have to be responsible with those dollars that we receive. So I think the messaging here is really important. Of course, we have, everybody wants a pool, everybody wants all these other things too, and we're going to have to address them separately. Also, we're talking about building, a large park / baseball stadium. And so that's going to be another discussion that we're going to have and how that's combined with the messaging. So it's really going to be, it's just going to be a lot of heavy lifting for us as council members. And so we appreciate everything that you've done for us and the studies and the work and your patience. I know if I was an accountant sitting on the sidelines, I know you've been speaking to us about the deficit problems for a long time, and I really appreciate that. Thank you for your patience with the system. So, thank you.
Any other discussion? Well, it sounds like I'm not going to be here when we are voting for this, but I'm here to help think about how we analyze it. And so I think there's probably some more information that you can bring forward, Susie, so we can look at the options for how long we want the money to last. It's kind of similar to the EMS levy where we are constantly getting eroded. One of the factors that has played a role in our deficit, aside from the tax legislation that kind of put a halt to our property tax collections, has to do with funding of salaries and benefits for the people that work at the city. And we have a couple pressures. One of the big pressures that I think our public knows about is, we're just competing for talent like all other businesses around the region. But the other pressure is that we, through our labor negotiations and the way that those contracts work, we are often faced with having to keep up with other cities who've made other choices around how they manage their city services. And we had in the, was it the Burke study? Did the Burke do the study for us? I can't remember who we did that study. We learned in that study that most cities have sort of shed some of the major services that we are still providing in-house. Many of them we see here on this list. But it's an ongoing problem for us. I mean, this is just the financial reality is that a structural deficit means that our business model just does not work. And so what I want to see us do is look at any kind of revenue funding that would allow us to have a business model that works better, so that we can make plans and know what we're moving forward with. So I'll be looking at that funding stream and how we can work that in. And I hope that we will look at some projections that show, based on what we've already negotiated and what our historical salary and benefits changes have been, because that's our big cost driver. What does our reality look like as we look forward, assuming that our business model is very similar to what it is now? And we don't see us getting a lot of economies in terms of efficient staffing. A lot of the stuff we do is still very hands-on type work. But we have made some investments in technology to help with a few things, and I know we've got a few other projects planned, but it'd be really nice for us to have a look 5 years out at least to say, okay, if we take on this level of a lid lift at this point, how long does that help us bridge that gap, given where we know we're probably going to be in the future? So I hope that we can bring that back and have those discussions.
Oh, absolutely, and we do have a model that
I
does
know you
just
do.
that, so.
Yeah, great. Vice President Tweet.
Yeah, Susie, I just have one question to kind of link in with Brenda, or Councilmember Stonecipher's comment. So when we look out 5 years, and our projected growth, population growth is greater than inflation, I would think. And also that means more services that we have to provide for more people that live here. So I'm concerned that it's hard for us to project, well, what does that do to fire and police, our essential services and all this? And as we look at 5 years out and 10 years out, I just want to make sure that that is a big factor. And then we can hopefully be realistic in what our staffing needs are going to be as we get to those years.
Thank you, and we are working on some analysis for staffing projections.
Oh, good.
And
That's a tough one.
you make a good point. I mean, we haven't grown very quickly over the last several years, maybe 1 to 1.5% per year. But they sure are projecting that the population is going to grow much more quickly than that. At least that's the projections you get from the planners.
Right.
So,
Yeah, one more question.
Councilmember Schwab.
This is a process that, and I kind of tag on to what Councilwoman Ryan was saying, and that is about the process of budget presentation and preparation. If we wait for a November vote, that means we may have to be looking at 2 budgets.
yes.
So that's double the work. So we'll have to be looking at a budget without a levy lid increase, by the way, which I'm in favor of, and a budget without, with one and without.
Absolutely.
So that's double the work. And then also, this group is going to have to decide in advance, well, just in case it doesn't pass, what areas that we may need to cut. And I don't know, that seems like an exercise. I don't know if it's necessary. Does that outweigh the timing of having the vote, all that work, and making decisions on where we may need to cut? Or having the vote earlier? I mean, it seems like there's a counter as far as work and effort. I mean, are we going to be able to continue services? I'm assuming we're not in 2025 if the levy doesn't pass.
There will have to be some really difficult decisions.
Mm-hmm.
What we're going to need to do to balance 24 is certainly not ideal. And it doesn't get any better, as time marches forward. So, I personally don't know what is the best ballot month to go forward with something like this. I think there's probably people that do know that. However, I will say that if the November ballot was chosen, and I don't know which is the best, but if it was, the vote would be in before we started budget hearings. So we would know one way or the other whether we were getting, which proposed budget we would be talking about at the hearings.
Councilmember Vogely.
10 seconds. I just wanted to remind people, we've already lost the animal farm. We've already lost the swimming pool, and a lot of 4th of July stuff. So, I mean, things that we really, really like that have been a pillar of this community are already gone. So imagine the more difficult.
Library hours, recreational programs in the parks.
So,
I mean, every year we chip away.
Yeah.
Great. Any other last questions or comments before we adjourn? Thank you, Susie. I don't remember when our next meeting is, but we will see.
Actually, I don't believe well, we do have a tentative schedule for that. Do you have that, Heidi?
It's end of June. June
So
28th.
June 28th, which
June
would be a
28th.
part of the regular council meeting.
Okay, very good. We will see you back. We'll see you before then, but we will see you back on June 28th for sure.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Heidi. We are adjourned.